So one of the things I learned from Boz Javijan when I started working on this profile of Grace was kind of the amount of knowledge that Grace has amassed in terms of what can go wrong in a church or a church community or a Christian institution to make it be a haven for abusers, as Boz sometimes likes to say. And he talks a lot about a few different things. First, that just kind of statistically, there are huge numbers of sex abuse victims, far more than I frankly knew. That there are 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men by the time they're 18 will have been sexually abused. So that even a relatively, a modest-sized church of about 1,000 people could have a few hundred people within it who are survivors of sex abuse. But also that there are, within churches, there are kind of some traits that make them at the same time very open and welcoming places for new people. They want new people to come, but also make them very vulnerable to potential abusers. And a lot of that is, the fact that churches are very hungry for volunteers. And so for a very long time, really kind of anybody who wanted to work in a children's ministry in the Sunday school was allowed to do so without being properly vetted. Even now, when most churches are compelled by the insurance companies to do those checks, still, oftentimes you need more vigorous checks than just the bare minimum. And also kind of some very frightening and telling things. Research from people who study sex offenders has shown that some 93% of convicted sex offenders say that they identify as deeply religious, and those who say that they are very religious tend to abuse more children and younger children. And as one sex offender told a clinician who was studying sex offenders, he said that church people are easy to fool. So in some ways, churches just become these targets. And the thing that can also make them havens is when church leadership really doesn't understand the dynamics of sex abuse and what victims need in terms of not being re-victimized by the church's response. Too many times, Boz said he would, when he was a criminal sex abuse prosecutor himself, he would go to court and he would see pastors come and sit on the side of the accused. They were there in a supportive role for the alleged sex offender rather than the alleged victim. And it'd be one thing if, that was once in a while, but he said that was something that was fairly consistent, that the pastors tended to be there to support the accused. So I think when you have these sorts of dynamics going on in Christian institutions, this can all amount to something that Boz also talks about as spiritual abuse, which is the idea of religious faith, the Bible, scripture, people's devotion being used against them to make them do things that are unhealthy for themselves. So for example, telling victims that they need to forgive because that's their Christian duty, whether or not there has been any sort of real accountability taken for the crimes against them, or in other cases, either telling victims, this would be an abuser telling victims that what they're doing is not a sin, that this is love and it's pleasing to God on the one hand, or on the other hand, telling them that they had participated in a sin and now they needed to cover it up because they were sinful and they couldn't let anyone else know. So these are some of the different ways in which people's faith is manipulated to cover up abuse.